All right. Welcome, everyone, to paper session number 2. I'm Professor Kel Karpinski. My pronouns are they and he. So we're going to get started with this next session. Our first presenter, Virginia L. Conn, is not actually here right now, but we are going to be playing a video of her presentation, and she'll be here this afternoon. So if you have questions, remember them until this afternoon.
Hi everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there in person to present today. I will be around in the afternoon sessions for any. In the meantime, however, I'll get on with the presentation. So, science fiction has historically had a contentious relationship with scientific development at the same time that technological products coming onto the market have long relied on rosy narratives for their further popularization. AI 2041, 10 Visions for Our Future, is the latest collaboration between science fiction author Choi Fan and former head of Google China and current CEO of Sinovation Ventures, Kai-Fu Lee. And it sits solidly at the intersection of these narrative selling points. And the selling point is exactly what's being made here. Artificial intelligence, Lee claims in the introduction, is the world's hottest technology, while Chen posits that from the past era to the present day, the unstoppable force of AI has been revolutionizing every dimension of human civilization. Enthusiastic about their vision for a world transformed by AI, the two collaborated on what would become a sort of call-and-response example of scientific fiction, science fiction, in which Chen contributed 10 short stories focusing on individual aspects of AI technology set within the next 20 years, while Lee follows up with an explanation of that technology in the present, how it works, how it's applied, and how it's likely to develop in the coming decades. Now, as a textual product, it's both entertaining and informative, imagining a world that feels at once both familiar and radically different from our own. For all its entertainment value, however, the ethics of a project that attempts to imagine a future in which AI is a central driver of progress are insufficiently examined, resulting in a text that's techno-utopian at best and deliberately obfuscatory about its intentions at worst. In fact, given Lee's enormous investment in ensuring that the public accepts AI technologies developed by his various companies, the stakes of this project seem to be less about speculative futures and more about neutralizing potential part of consumers in the present. So, at the heart of AI 2041 is fiction's presumed ability to imagine, predict, and at some level, shape the future. Outlets like Wired report that Chinese science fiction authors like Choi Fan have been elevated to the status of oracles, with his work defined as realism, a term used since the 1950s to characterize science fiction that critically evaluates the present level of technology in society. The idea that sci-fi does something is increasingly being taken up in science and technology studies too, with a special issue of Osiris dedicated to science fiction and the history of science, including 2 articles devoted to Chinese science fiction forms and their real-world effects. International policy historian Julian Gewurz has written a well-regarded article on how Alvin and Heidi Toffler's Future Shock influenced Chinese science and technology policies in the period of reform and opening up that began in the 80s. Today, Chen is widely seen as the successor to this type of science fictional speculation in the tech world. And Chen's quasi-prophetic status is actually really central to AI 2041's conceit that it might not be long until these stories all become true. As such, the selling point of the book is that while its science fictional visions are themselves only imaginary, They draw on real technology and represent real possible paths for the development of AI. And not in a distant future, either. AI 2041 takes its name seriously. Lee claims that the technologies in the book have at least an 80% likelihood of coming to pass by 2041, with the book representing a responsible and likely set of scenarios, quote unquote. This prediction may seem far-fetched, but readers are likely to recognize many of the technologies already present in their own lives in 2021 when this was released. In the first story, The Golden Elephant, for example, Chen introduces an insurance company that uses deep learning technology to make predictions affecting individual premiums. While in Contactless Love, players find love through participating in online role-playing games amidst the ravages of COVID-19. AI 2041, then, with its unique marriage of factual explanation and fictional short stories, joins the rank of a genre that'll be familiar to most of you in the audience, the techno-utopian promise. But it's maybe more legible through the lens of technological solutionism, a term coined by tech writer Evgeny Morozov to describe the idea that complex social phenomena, everything from politics to education to healthcare to agriculture, can be understood as, quote, neatly defined problems with a definite, computable solution, or as transparent and self-evident processes subject to easy optimization, if only the right algorithms are in place. The ideological framework of solutionism shifts our view of the world to redefine things such as inefficiency or human relations as problems with a technological solution. The technology itself, Lee and Chen claim, is neutral. It's human behavior that's unethical or inefficient, requiring technological intervention. We see this shift towards neutral technological solutionism in Twin Sparrows, for example, a story in which a character's autistic behavior is mollified not through a change in structures, but through the introduction of an AI companion that can uniquely understand him. Lee's exuberant promotion of AI technologies as the solution to most existing social problems not only addresses these problems themselves, but also redefines human behavior as a problem in and of itself that can be solved through the application of neutral or even benevolent AI. In fact, AI is explicitly and frequently described by Lee throughout the text as neutral, an objective technology that only acquires ethical value through its use by humans. This is a popular idea in technological innovation spheres, and it's also a wrong one. Because such technologies are developed by private corporations and their IP holdings are heavily guarded, it can be almost impossible to discover how a particular artificial intelligence or algorithm was designed, what data set or corpus helped build it, or even how it works at all. The act of developing an AI involves training it on massive quantities of data, and as Lee points out in his explanation of deep learning, the program comes to recognize patterns that guide its predictive abilities. When the predicted outcome or pattern replicate human biases inherent to the original data, the algorithm recreates systemic, repeatable errors, resulting in the perpetuation of oftentimes discrimination. Lee and Chen recognize this. The very first story in the collection, the one I just mentioned, The Golden Elephant, deals with it explicitly, in fact. But they attribute this to human bias only and don't engage with the possibility of bias being an inextricable part of the technology itself. If there's a problem in society, Lee and Chen posit, some form of AI will solve it. And, well, arises as a result of this intervention, that's the fault of the human developers and users, not the technology. AI, then, despite all of Lee's very careful explanations of various forms of technological processes, functions as this curiously abstract object. It's an object and concept that seem completely divorced from its social reality. If AI did something good, it's because AI is good. If AI does something bad, well, no, it didn't. The user did, or the creator did. The text transports AI from the realm of a socially embedded tool to the realm of a conceptual cure-all to all social ills, without recognizing it as a product of those same societies. This isn't at all to say that Li and Chen ignore problems that develop from the use of increasingly sophisticated AI technology, but rather that those problems are blamed on people, while successes are attributed to the technology itself. As a result, AI 2041 can be read as an attempt to validate the expansion of data exploitation technology of the type represented by Google, which, of course, as former head of Google China, Li is especially prone to rhapsodizing. As a speculative industrial technology, the reification of AI demands the optimization and financialization of everyday operations in the interest of big tech market growth, while continuing to insist this benefits everyone. Yet, it's the individual behavior that's called to account for the subsequent problems arising from its use, not the creators of the technology, nor even the technology itself. In The Golden Elephant, for example, to go back to this common example, Ganesha Insurance, a deep learning-enabled insurance program, optimizes every action and interaction in India to obtain the best premiums for its citizens, but has been well documented, and especially topical recently, relying on deep learning algorithms that have been trained on prior demographic data results in a retrenchment of existing social divisions. In this case, the caste system. In this particular story, for example, the protagonist is warned away from even talking to her love interest, who lives in a historically lower caste neighborhood. The Ganesha algorithm used by her family's insurance company has been trained on a corpus of demographic data that conflates data about crime, income, location, etc., to arrive at the objective conclusion that interacting with people from this neighborhood is likely to result in adverse outcomes. The algorithm itself cannot act as an activist identify in the first place the redlining policies that have led to this inequality and can only make predictions based on historical data. This type of algorithmic bias has been written about extensively by scholars and authors such as Ruha Binyamin, Safiya Imogen Noble, and Ruman Chowdhury. Not address this entrenched bias here except to present it as an attribute of human behavior, not a problem with the technology itself. So, despite a fundamental flaw with the book's approach to the role of technology, the collaborative format juxtaposing short stories with a layperson's explanation of AI concepts is actually really interesting for literature fans and futurists alike. One can really easily see how this project fits into similar experiments, such as the Center for Imagination's monthly Future Tense Fictions, which pairs a piece of short fiction about developments in science and technology with a response by experts working in that field, or the work of the futurist forecasting company Sci Futures, which employs a rotating stable of science fiction authors to prototype futures and accelerate innovation. And this includes most notably Ken Liu, Chen's first translator, mentor, and friend. As a supposed oracle of future development, though, one has to wonder if Chen is writing himself out of the very narrative he's constructing. Elsewhere, Li has developed an algorithm that replicates Chen's voice, and the short story, The State of Trance, which is not included in this collection, incorporates passages generated by the Chen AI, and it won first place in a Shanghai literary competition. The competition itself by an AI that had been trained on the same sort of corpuses and data sets discussed here in AI 2041, and the AI judge deemed the artificially generated text superior to writings submitted by, for example, the Nobel laureate for literature, Mo Yan. Li has gone on the record, both in this book and elsewhere, to claim that AI is fundamentally incapable of creativity, But if it is capable of reproducing an author's voice so exactly that it's indistinguishable from the real thing, it may very well be that the next collaboration will be between Lee and an AI co-author instead of Chin himself. Well, is all of this to say that artificial intelligence as a concept and as presented here in AI 2041 specifically is bad? No, but neither is it a net good, as Lee posits often, or even neutral, as when he writes, technology is inherently neutral. It's for people who use it for purposes both good and evil. Artificial intelligence can only do what humans have trained it to do in the way they have trained it to learn. It can't be separated from its sociocultural and technological embeddings. As current CEO of Science Ventures and a senior executive at Microsoft, SGI, and Apple, Lee has a lot to gain financially from the promotion of AI as a set of tools, and much to protect in his assertions that its enormous problems are, quote, not inflicted by AI, but by humans who use AI maliciously or carelessly. I think it's hardly reactionary to be suspicious of the promotion of items that can be developed by and profited off of by companies with investments in education, as we see in the story Twin Sparrows, which mirrors the rise of online surveillance software for education like Proctorio or Microsoft's own partner Pearson VUE. The Internet of Things, as with several of Sinovation's investments, such as MEGV and Form Paradigm, and which is endemic throughout each of these stories. Autonomous vehicles, as in AI 2041's The Holy Driver, and in real life, Sinovation's investment Momenta alongside Google's Waymo, and more. But perhaps the most egregious of this preciousness towards AI can be seen in how the authors conceptualize risk and harm, as well as the role AI technology plays in mitigating them. Even as Lee's own venture capital firm invests in the development of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency supercomputing hardware, quantum genocide, that it's actually AI-enabled autonomous weapons that are the, quote, greatest danger from AI. This, maybe more than anything else, illustrates the aimed at promoting the, quote, hugely beneficial role AI and AI development companies will offer to humanity despite its human costs, which can conceive of weapons as threats, but not the existential threat of automation in insurance, transportation, and medical decisions that kill far more people in far less flashy ways. Within this same story, Bitcoin, a technology we increasingly know has caused environmental degradation at a staggering rate, accelerating climate change worldwide, is lauded as a desirable technology even when the exact same story describes climate change as an existential threat to humanity. It's not Lee's explanations of this technology, which are clear, rigorous, and detailed, that are the problem, but his framing of AI technologies as separate from the financial interests behind their development, and which posit companies like his own as simply the providers of unproblematic technological solutions. So then, is all this to say that AI 2041 as a text is bad as in literature, or bad as in conceptual ethics? No to the first, but perhaps to the second. Fans of Chin's science fiction will find much to love here, but there's something really distinctly uncomfortable about reading a collaboration between someone who predicts the future in fiction alongside a representative of major corporate interests who claim to be building such a future. One gets the impression that Chin is attempting to remain neutral in his descriptions of how AI can and already is shaping our world, even as Lee describes the same technology as itself ethically neutral. But in the world we have right now, the one that's poised on the brink of an AI revolution that is itself the product of human biases and uneven application, who can afford to be neutral? Now, one last thing that I want to say here is that After I initially published this review, I published it back in 2022, pretty shortly after this was published initially. It was met with very strong and immediate pushback from Chen himself. His refutations were well informed, but ultimately did not address the project of corporate normalization that I identified. I'd love to discuss it with you further. Obviously, we can't in this format. So if you want to find me in the afternoon sessions or after the conference, we can talk about his response and where we go from here with predictions about AI development. So thank you very much. Happy to be here, and I'll see you all later. Bye.
Later today to take questions.
So our second presenter, Nathan Lamarche, is joining us from the University of Alberta, and Nathan's presentation is Monotheistic Ethics in Caprica, the Consequences of AI Development on Queer Futurity.
One moment, please, everyone. Take it to Fisherman's Friends.
Hi. Testing. Hi. I am a little sick. I do apologize. So my slides are, yes, okay, fairly minimal, and mostly reference some citations I have. Not all citations are up. If you'd like to follow along with the paper as I present the QR code, I've posted it to my university's platform for theses, dissertations, presentations, and so on. So the monotheistic ethics in Caprica, the consequences of AI development on queer futurity. It doesn't concern you, sister, that kind of absolutist view of the universe. Right and wrong determined by a single, all-knowing, all-powerful being whose judgment cannot be questioned, and in whose name the most horrendous facts can be sanctioned without appeal. This is the question asked in the pilot episode of Caprica, the prequel to Battlestar Galactica, and a show depicting both the emergence of sentient artificial intelligence and the cultural conflict between polytheistic and monotheistic structures of belief and moral values. Detective Durham in this show is a devout man to the polytheistic status quo and stands theistically opposed to Sister Clarice, the headmistress of the Athenian Academy, who portrays herself publicly as polytheistic, but secretly leads a cell of the Soldiers of the One, the militarized terrorism branch of the monotheistic Church of the Colonies, zealots responsible for the recent bombing of a train. It is with irony that shortly after this quote, he tells her, "Know your enemy," and she echoes back, "Love your enemy, Agent Durham." That is what we followers of Athena believe. So this black and white commentary on a monotheistic system of ethics is similar to the criticism of religion's treatment of queer communities. Abram Brummett, in his paper on queer reproductive rights and access to assisted reproductive technologies, argues that conscious claims against LGBT individuals ought to be constrained because the underlying metaphysic that God has decreed the LGBT lifestyle to be simple is highly implausible. Just as the Soldiers of the One use in their acts of terror, this is also an illogical justification. Yet, as Brummett notes, and as we can see in the current global political climate, queer communities face oppression. For instance, with some clinics in the United States using overt policies or subtle methods of limiting access to reproductive health care. There are also growing political threats to queer rights. Which decisions require moral justification to enact? Who decides what's right and wrong? Who opts to restrict queer rights? So I'm going to ask you guys this consciously at a symposium on artificial intelligence. What systems might humanity use to make those decisions tomorrow? The AI machines, named Cylons in Caprica and Battlestar Galactica, carry a code of ethics that positions a right and a wrong, an objective good and evil. And in Battlestar Galactica, this code of ethics, in service of their god, is used to justify simultaneous surprise attack that results in the near total annihilation of the human race. Agent Durham was fundamentally correct in his assessment of dichotomous ethics. The actions taken by the Cylons over the course of Battlestar Galactica mirror modern colonial oppressive regimes. And those same black and white codes of dichotomous ethics are used to justify or excuse their actions. At one point in the series, the Cylons decide entirely without remorse that the genocide was a mistake. Sorry, our bad, oopsies, well, no harm done. And it would just be the best idea, really, to live with the humans on a planet called New Caprica, that the humans had believed would be a refuge from the machines. The Cylons trespass on this new world, impose their own system of law and order, strip the colonized humans of their rights, abduct and detain or execute dissidents, and commit countless horrific acts in the name of living together in harmony. Colonization is the antithesis of queer identity and freedom. Conversations converging native studies and queer theory, for instance, recognize the persistency of heteropatriarchal structures wrought by colonialist regimes by imposing a disappearance not only on indigenous peoples, but on queer peoples as well, and that the queering of decolonization is an essential step in having such conversations. So, queer futurity is a theory that was proposed by a scholar named José Esteban Munoz. His argument was that queerness is defined as something you do, not just what you are, and that there is a horizon in the distance that we're struggling to reach, a point of greater freedom, of a better life. But whenever you take a step towards the horizon steps back. The freedoms the LGBTQA community has today might have been a horizon 50 years ago. It's subjective. When Canada had gay marriage and the US didn't, the queer horizon was different in those two countries. There's still the death penalty in homosexuality in some parts of the world. A horizon can be distinct to any person, place, or time, and it can apply to other groups experiencing oppression as well. A futurity is the fight for that horizon, and there's always another horizon. But there's another half to this coin. With every step forward, the tides of oppression carry us back. Our fight for a horizon mirrors another fight against it. Colonization is intrinsic. It's pervasive. It's fundamental to the very core of our society. As the Cylon pursuit is fundamental intrinsic to the lives of the humans in Battlestar Galactica post-genocide, the values our world holds against queerness are that of invisibility. The claim so often made that I don't care what you do as long as it's not in my face reflects societal values. How many advertisements use heterosexual appeal as a selling point? There's a supposed default state that by its very nature oppresses the push for queer futurity. It is a deep, ingrained concept even in queer communities, both at the institutional and social level. It isn't necessarily that someone is at fault, nor committing willful acts of anti-queering, but the message is so deep that its outcome is inevitable, embedded in the subconscious. Now, generative artificial intelligence is a system that emulates the default, and in turn, the collective subconscious. Who are the people working to develop it? The majority are extremely well educated and well paid, with positions across all fields at OpenAI, earning hundreds of thousands to even over $1 million in annual salaries in 2024. But what ratio of these developers are queer? How many are indigenous? How many come from countries not considered part of the West? As Damian Patrick Williams puts it, we must continuously ask ourselves, who's in the room when we make the decisions that influence, shape, or even determine research directions? These questions are essential for shaping our future reality. The perspectives and logics we use to craft AI are just as biased as we are, and not only reflect the systems that have created harm through its own biases, but will create that harm again. In Battlestar Galactica, the outsourcing of public power away from human beings and towards the Cylons created a violated space devoid of human rights and legal systems. The exact same outsourcing of queer power to a heteronormative society also deprives queer rights. This is where Detective Durham's observations hit so strongly. The first sentient AI model is modeled identically to her creator, a victim of the train bombing. She retains her creator's personality, her fictional ties, her expressions and innate biases, including religious beliefs. Imposing our own subconscious biases on AI will result in a regime, a new era, an AI empire, built on the very foundations of oppression, which we need to redevelop from the ground up, starting with our core philosophies and innate assumptions surrounding its conception. Yet even the most thoughtful and thoroughgoing intervention cannot come close to confronting its deep roots, which are based in subconscious oppression. Proposed approaches to improved AI developmental ethics include training, policy writing, and the consideration of potential world impact. But these fall short in diversifying hiring practices and incorporating non-Western codes of ethics. We need these diverse perspectives to have an ethical influence. What happens when an oppressive regime is backed by religious connotations of sin, for instance, that decide to use generative AI to maliciously pursue queer communities? What happens when an individual or an organization or a nation opts to create Gen AI for this exact purpose? Outsourcing our political power our public power away from human beings would result in a violation of our rights and legal systems. So Isherwood notes that queer theology, with its postmodern roots, asks us to distrust any master narrative. And in this case, the master narrative is not of a divine being, but of a machine god, a purveyor of all of our deepest and darkest secrets, our flaws and biases. The development of Gen AI itself creates a master narrative. This is what I mean by monotheistic ethics. It's not about actual gods and divinity. It's not about our true religions. Just as Caprica parallels monotheistic ethics that ultimately justify asylum genocide against humanity, we must be cautious of single-minded codes of morality in the directional development of generative AI, where lacking developer diversity defaults in narrow worldviews, creating a risk of disproportionate impact on queer communities. A single woman's avatar formed the framework of Caprica's Cylons and their eventual extermination of the human race. Developer homogeneity creates a disproportionate risk, especially in harm to queer communities, who see impact and oppression no matter their origin. Suggested approaches to AI ethics fail to address the need for diverse perspectives and foundational philosophical shortcomings. I want to elaborate briefly. When I say diversity, I don't just mean race and sexuality. There are many, many things that contribute to diversity, from what city you're from, poverty, right? Whether you were bullied in high school, these things all have a very drastic impact on how we perceive reality. And they're going to impact how we view ethics and moral choice. Schneider's book, Beyond Monotheism, Theory of Multiplicity, notes the archaic nature of this code of ethics. When modern legal and social battles have us fighting for queer rights, the problem lies in our perceptions of AI ethics. We are not anywhere near concerned enough with whether AI could impose a perpetual status quo, where the only thing that might change it is the will of the ruling class and the decisions made by the individuals with the wealth and power to do so. And this is not limited to the ruling class. AI is already capable of profiling, and algorithmic frameworks are used to categorize who deserves or needs help and who doesn't. Schneider notes the archaic nature of an anti-queer code of ethics, but imperialism forms the blood and bone of society. AI will one day soon even be capable of the distribution of judgment based on its own concepts of sin, which are inherited by our subconscious imperialistic views. So non-AI automated systems of justice are in fact already here, outside of automation, such as Alberta's Provincial Administrative Penalties Act, which you can read on the screen, the parts I've cited in the paper, where legal reviews are held remotely and are not bound by evidence checks. This mostly applies to traffic violations, but all the same, it's an automated justice that forecasts a future where AI might not only be involved, but it might be a central leader and figure in these decisions. It's already being used in some parts of the world. And this is a paraphrase of a paper by Olaneers, which I highly recommend reading. It's quite fascinating. And he notes several places in the world where AI judges are being used to determine guilt and innocence. So how long before we let it write legal policies that could have a direct impact on queer freedom? Look at the governance by the Cylons on New Caprica, or in Canada and the United States, which are blatantly ignoring treaties and freedoms made with Indigenous peoples. These are systems of governments influenced by colonization. A government with AI influence would be perpetual, an embedded toxin that we can't address or convince otherwise. It would be one with dichotomous ethics, the same monotheistic concepts of objective good and evil critiqued in Caprica. Who determines right and wrong? what happens when AI is used as a tool of oppression by groups with a preconceived notion of sin. If our society maintains subconscious bias and restricts queer rights and human rights, and if our biases are passed on to generative artificial intelligence, and if it will one day write our policies, police our streets, determine healthcare access, and judge us in our courtrooms, at what point do we realize that the ruling class will no longer be limited to a collective of human beings? Caprica and Battlestar Galactica embody a colonial, oppressive regime that mirrors real life. But this isn't a regime we can fight and overcome. It's an algorithmic one. We can't change its mind. It can be programmed to think and do precisely what its creators or controllers want it to do. Queer rights exist today for as long as we fight for them to exist. But queer rights tomorrow faces an existential threat. How long will it be before the people are saying that God says your identity is sinful, and they gain the power to command AI to carry out a colonized disappearance? Caprica's Cylons operate at a more complex level of coding than our technology can muster, or will muster for the foreseeable future. Our generative AI at our level of technology is black and white. There is no empathy, no nuance, no understanding. Only an illusion of it, generated to please the status quo, the algorithm generator, and brought to you by our own inner failings. So do we trust ourselves? Not this version of ourselves that we aspire to be, but the version that we are. The whole cold, hard reality of the situation. Humans are kind of terrible. Can you honestly say that you aren't a biased individual on any level? This isn't about some innate criticism of any religious God, but rather how God exists in our society. How divine dichotomous truth is represented in our legal, moral, and social frameworks. Religion offers ethics when we don't have the answers. But the actual applications of those ethics are a large reason for why we need to have conversations about queer futurity and why we need to fight for it. Can we be expected to always know what to do, to always recognize right from wrong? AI offers that recognition. It's tainted, though, by both an intrinsic limitation of its own coding and a flawed human filter. What makes ethical sense is not a factor here, because AI takes its data from our innate beliefs and biases, from our perceptions of right and wrong, not from any sort of divine objective truth. So does it concern us to have right and wrong be determined solely by a single, all-knowing, all-powerful being whose judgment cannot be questioned and in whose name the most horrendous of acts can be sanctioned without appeal? Is Caprica a warning of AI's relationship with our own internal biases? So the question I want to leave you all thinking about today is really quite straightforward. Are we building a God?
Thank you. And our final presenter is Adam McLain, who's joining us from the University of Connecticut. Adam's presentation is on computational poetics, Franny, Choi, soft science, and the dialogues to come.
You guys can ponder God while I'm getting set up a little bit and think about the existential threat of what we're doing. Alright, can you guys hear me in the back okay? Is that good? Okay. If I go over like quiet, just like, flag me down, wave at me, just stand up and walk out, that's okay too. All right, so today I'm talking, my paper's called, as was said, Computational Poetics, Franny Choi's Soft Science and the Dialogues to Come. I'm thinking about the relationship of AI with poetry, which is a lot of fun, because we all love poetry, we all hate poetry at the same time. It's this really good tension that you live in as you struggle through it. I also struggle through that, so we're going to struggle through the poetry together in many ways. So my paper begins out here. So an AI can write poetry. If you're like me, you're probably all looking at that a little skeptically. Can an AI really write? Because we must clarify, as always, what we mean in this somewhat provocative sentence of an AI can write poetry. Words like artificial intelligence, AI, is it, for example, a reactive machine like Netflix's recommendation engine? Is it a limited memory form, which is the predictive format of ChatGPT? Is it a theory of mind, which is understanding thoughts and emotions of other entities in an AI system? Or is it a self-aware where it understands itself and its relationship to others? So those are 4 ideas of AI that IBM came up with. The word can, considering, possible. Is it possible that an AI can write poetry? The word write, does creation or generation mean to write? Does copying other words and reformatting them in different ways really mean writing? And poetry. Can poetry be from a non-human entity, or an entity that was created by humans and has formed into something else? Is there poetry in machines, just as there might be poetry in, say, nature? Just as there's poetry perhaps in you existing as a human being? Taking those words apart complicates the sentences a lot and helps us sit with that skepticism we might have with a sentence like this. We might find the sentence, an AI can write poetry, discomforting because poetry feels like such a human, non-robotic thing to be. How can a large language model or a thinking computerized brain formulate the emotions behind the words of a poet used to sculpt onto the page their innermost existence? Perhaps we might be more comfortable then if we reframed the question a little bit and reframed the sentence. Instead of writing, instead of poetry, what if we said, an AI generates a poem? Here, we've changed the word write, the word can, and the word poetry. AI, similar to ChatGPT, Claude AI, etc., have the capacity and capability to generate the form and structure of a poem. Here, AI still means various tools created through algorithmic programming, but the term generates reframes the word writing and makes it more formalistic in some ways, while poem isn't as lofty per se as poetry. A single poem in itself can just be a line, etc., but poetry is a grander, broader literary idea. So an example of one of these poems is easy to come by. Last night, as I was writing up this really quick, also as I was writing it on the train down here, I pulled up ChatGPT to do just that, to write a little poem for us so we can kind of analyze it a little bit. I asked it to write a poem similar to Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, because of course we have to go back to Shakespeare when we're talking about poetry, always, which I'll quickly remind us of here. Sonnet 18 says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his golden complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But the eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou oust. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in its shade, when in eternal lines to me thou growst. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." Shakespeare's sonnet, of course, follows a form. It's a form that he helps create and format. It follows a meter, and it follows a turn at the end, where it comes to a different idea. To analyze this poem, we consider how a human being, the poet here, is talking to another in some ways, and how he uses the form to consider human connection in relation to weather, the cosmic powers dancing in the heavens, and the fear of death's long shadow. So I took this poem and I asked ChatGPT to create a poem like it, or to write something that was similar to it. And it gave me a structural response first, because it gives a little tiny brief introduction, where it said, a Shakespearean sonnet is 14 lines written in iambic pentameter with an AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG rhyme scheme. So it's got some of the knowledge there, right? We got it out. But then it gave me this poem right here, which I won't take the time to read it, because we're going to analyze it a little bit later. But if you notice, it doesn't follow the rhyme scheme it gave me at the very beginning. So I had to take a moment and look through it and go, okay, what is this not doing when it comes to Shakespearean sonnets? So it doesn't follow the rhyme scheme exactly. So instead of the AB flipping, it does rhyming couplets, which is fine, but not quite what I asked for. So I had to request it to change a little bit. It acknowledged its own mistake, which was really great. And it gave me the second version here, where it actually does follow the AB format. It did it really quickly, too, in a few seconds, which is great as a student if you're writing a sonnet for your class overnight, right? We're not going to deal with those problems in this paper, but this is the poem that I want to take for a second to think along beside that other sonnet. So this one says, "Shall I compare thee to a moonlit night? Thy glow outshines the stars in heaven's dome, the gentle winds that stir the world's delight, bear whispers soft, yet cannot call thee home. The fleeting dusk fades swiftly into morn, and all its silver splendor turns to gray. But thou, untouched by time, art never worn. Thy beauty shines beyond the break of day. Though nature bends to season's ceaseless march, and all must yield to winter's frozen sting, thy radiance glows beneath love's vaulted arch, an endless boom, eternal as the spring. So long as words are breathed by heart set free, thy light shall live in verse, remembered thee. It's nice. It's a fair sonnet, maybe. It made a simple, almost one-to-one comparison to Sonnet 18, that one that I asked it to mimic. Notice the change from summer's day to moonlit night, the emphasis of the same celestial events, and the ending of remembering in life through the poem itself. The thematic effect is there. The rhyming form is there, after I gave it a little, push. The words are there. I unfortunately didn't have time to check the meter or any of the rhyming form, or the measured format of each line. So I don't know if it's exactly an iambic pentameter. That's always where you can kind of question it and look at it. But I didn't have the time to do that. So it at least has, 10 notes to it. So it's in a pentameter, but I don't know if the iambs are on the direct thing. Someone's doing it for me, so that's great. I'm not that good with Shakespearean stuff, so I'm going to leave that for another time. But I just want to note that it creates and pulls from the other poems and creating this one-to-one connection as just a starting point for this paper. Because this paper, it's not about AI's creation of poetry or how we handle the relationship of AI and poetry in publishing or the classroom. Those are important conversations to have in the wake of machine learning and large language models growing popular every day. Indeed, one could say we need to even hold space for them in many ways. In this paper, my aim is not to tell you how to stop students from using it or how to stop it from coming into your publishing field or anything like that. But I do want to bring out a specific attention to a set of questions around AI that I'm going to be using Franny Choi's soft science to think with, about, and through. So if AI can generate a poem, perhaps, and this is still up in the air, write poetry, questions of what a poem is and how we apply poetics to different genres and types of writing can occur. How might poetics help us assess form in an age where writing a form can be generated rather than created by hand? How might we use the forms of artificial intelligence, like algorithms and codes, to write our own poetry? What is the relationship of human beings to poetry and poetry to human beings? And we can even add into there to the AI systems themselves. And when those are estranged through the use of a learning model, is something new created, or can we still call it poetry? I began with these questions and these examples of poetry because I want to end up with us at the very end, reconsidering how we define poetry. This comparison of writing, human to machine, to me shows that at least a formalist structural poetry can be generated by artificial intelligence with some prodding, and it situates the analysis of poetry in the form or the structure, especially here since I used the sonnet. But does that form need to be specifically a rhyme scheme, a meter, etc., or can the form of the poem also itself be algorithmic? So we turn to then Franny Choi. So Franny Choi published the book Soft Science in 2019. It received much acclaim, becoming a finalist for awards like the Lambda Literary Award and the Publishing Triangle's Audre Lorde Award for Lesbian Poetry. Their other two books, 2014's Floating Brilliant Gone and 2022's The World Keeps Ending and The World Goes On, along with a 2017 chapbook, Death by Sex, delve deep into their writing around identity, sexuality, and speculation. In the paper, I'm going to just use Franny rather than the usual academic last name, because that's how Franny refers to themselves on their About Me page, and they also use she and they pronouns. So I may jump back and forth between those. So Franny, in all of the writing that they do, utilizes science fiction and its theoretical makeup, like cognitive estrangement that we talked about earlier, novum and things like that, along with tropes like cyborgs and robots, to reorient their reader toward new possible ontologies of the body and sexuality. Specifically in Soft Science, they frame the entire book around a Turing test. 6 different Turing tests, which form 6 different parts that each have their own sets of poems inside them. Which, obviously, a Turing test leads the reader to question whether the poets themselves are or are not a human. So in the first section, Turing test, we're introduced to this concept of the poet as a cyborg. Through the making of, Franny introduces this idea that the poetic image in the book is going to be something of the cyborg, pulling on Haraway's version of the cyborg along with others. And the second Turing test, empathetic response, Franny struggles through robotics and mortality with each other. And we get poems that try to understand the relationship of a robot who's considering itself in relation to its mortality as it is an android or a cyborg. And Turing test boundaries, with the boundary itself is placed and pushed against through those boundaries that are formed around robots and around human beings, the boundary of skin, the boundary of, the metal around your computer that you're taking notes on right now. One of my favorite poems here that we're not going to have time to deal with is called I Swiped Right to the Borg, thinking about Tinder and swiping right and responding to the Borg and getting into a relationship with them, which is exciting, but we're not going to talk about that. So you can do that tonight and read the rest of that. In Turing test problem solving, the poet sets out to understand or misunderstand the relationship to this robotic self that they've been creating, trying to piece together what it means to be this human who is doing that in a different way, but also a cyborg at the same time. And then in Turing Test Love, the poet foments the disparate natures of cyborg and human, collapsing them into something more. And in the final section, Turing Test Wait, expands beyond the possible into the impossible with this introduction to quantum theory poem. And then each of these tests, as the person's going throughout the poem, are thinking about the relationship of human to the normative body, to the queer body itself, and presenting the Turing test itself, which we can turn back to. Turing test, of course, comes from Alan Turing, who was pulling from the Imitation Game, which was this Victorian game about the way to tell a computer or machine, or if someone was a human or not, in many ways. And an instrumental from it comes from a 1950 essay called Computing, Machine, and Intelligence, where Turing says, I propose to consider the question, can machines think? In many ways, with Franny separating their poetry by Turing tests, they're asking, how does this poetry think of us? How is the poetry perhaps the cyborg itself? How is the poet a cyborg? And things like that. In this essay, Turing also asked, are there imaginable digital computers which would do well in the Imitation Game? This is the beginning of computing, the beginning of thinking about it. And so Turing is thinking about, how will computers expand our thinking, which today we know has expanded it in a decent amount. So in the poetry, Franny specifically focuses on the poet as cyborg and the cyborg itself as poet. Thinking through, for example, in the first poem, Making Of, when I say cyborg, I mean what man made. Franny is dealing a lot with this idea of how this concept of man, thinking about it through like the Sylvia Wynter sense of man, the I was almost saying all-inspiring, but it's not quite inspiring, but the all-encompassing idea of man as a controlling factor, being that if you are a cyborg, you are something that is man-made. Man is always influencing you in that symbolic sense. And then in A Brief History of Cyborgs, Franny writes, here in a seed is a cyborg, telling us what exactly this cyborg is, that the image that they're pulling across all these poems. A bleeding girl dragging a knife through the sand, an imaginary girl who dreams of becoming trash. So in this cyborg relationship, Franny is pulling on a lot of images and relationships of what is perhaps heteronormative, what is patriarchal, what is controlling in our society, and how does being female, being queer, being different than that affect the life and relationship to it. We have 20 minutes, right? To get it.
Yeah, so
Okay.
you've got Matt. You have like 8 minutes.
Okay, sweet. I have 5 here, so that's
Okay.
okay, so I wanted to focus this all, so that's all introduction to Franny's poetry, which I encourage everyone to read, especially because all of the poems usually deal in a science fictional manner, and they teach really well in a classroom, so if you're teaching in a classroom, that's great, and pull on their work for that. But I wanted to focus in on a specific poem called The Program for the Morning After. And I'm focusing just on the first stanza. It's 6 stanzas that are written just like this. If you notice, it's written basically like code in many ways. And it's basically asking, how do you respond to the morning after you have a one-night stand with someone? In many ways. And if you were reading this poem as a normal poem, you'd say, okay, did you think when you said yes, said on my way, pulled up open about what would stain your fingers, herring, butter, squid, seal musk, the teeth, fingers, and the throat, right? A poem is where you just read it line by line, you're going through it, you're giving it a different rhythm perhaps because of the spacing. But here, Franny is pulling in these other symbols, right? The semicolon, the open bracket, and the closed bracket at the end to form a algorithmic program, which I don't know a lot about programming. I only have taken one little data science class, which is what I'm pulling from. So if anyone knows more about it, I'd love to talk more about it with you. But if you take this as a program and you read it as a program, it forms different sentences as you take it, right? Did you think when you said yes? So we're just pulling from one part of the program, right, as it runs. Did you think when you said on my way? Did you think when you pulled up? Did you think when you pulled open? Did you think about what would stain your fingers? Herring, butter, squid, seal musk. Did you think about the teeth, fingers, and the throat? So here we're reading the poem as though it is itself a program. It's a code that you read through in order to pull out the many different formulations of what could happen in the morning after. Continuing on that way, you can pull out, did you think when you said on my way about the teeth? Did you think when you pulled up about what would stain your fingers, seal musk? And here you have to do some inputting yourself of figuring out what the punctuation is there, right? So in the parenthesis underneath that, I was thinking this could be a possible way of framing that punctuation, where you ask a question and give an answer. Did you think when you pulled up about what would stain your fingers, seal musk? And then did you think when you said yes about the teeth? Again, did you think when you said about the teeth, comma, fingers in the throat? So visualizing what the finger or what the teeth actually means. So the poem continues and does this for 6 different stanzas, where you have to pull it out and think about how each of the programs are being laid out in the poem. And this poem itself returns back to my thoughts about AI and generating poetry. If a poet can utilize the code that is writing our AI systems to form a poem, oh dear. That's the program inside here not wanting me to talk about this. So if a poet is utilizing the code that is creating our AI systems in order to generate poetry, how do we respond that back into the creation of code for algorithms? In other words, let's get that one. We have what I call computational poetics. How might code, algorithms, or AI rewrite our approach to poetry? We thought about that at the beginning of this presentation. But then in thinking about the way that Franny was utilizing algorithmic writing, code writing, to write their own poetry, how might poetry apply to code? In other words, if we got into the poetry underneath ChatGPT, could we consider that itself poetry? Could we consider the code that a computer scientist writes a poem in and of itself? And if we do that, how does that apply our literary aspects of poetics onto computer science, onto people who don't always engage with English or engage with literature in the way that you do in an English department, let's say. Which opens up what I call, the dialogues to come. Is poetry and poetics, the idea of poetry, a possible bridge between literature and computers? Is it a way that we can think about the code underneath our AIs? Is it a way to think about and bring more people into the humanities itself as we bring our skills of poetics and things like that to those who are writing code? So I'm going to end it there. If you want to talk more, you can email me about it. Thank you.
Thank you to our fantastic presenters. I'll now open it up for any questions from the audience.
Hi, again, thank you. Excellent talk. Adam, while this is in my mind, I'm really interested in this idea of commands and poetry. And I'm thinking back to Aristotelian poetics and these ideas of this formulaic approach to poetry, whereas poetry is often, not often, but maybe like subliminally thought of as a more creative and human output of, literary whatever it is that we do. So I'm wondering, are we moving away from this idea of, because you did that really interesting contraposition of the Shakespeare and the one written in it, you notice the couplet at the end was nonsensical on the ChatGPT one, which was, I love that. But if you look at yeah, you can do it, but there's going to be something missing, right? Like some of the really intricate types of poetry, like the septet or whatever, I think AI would be awesome at that, but just at the formula of it. And it's the same thing with coding, so I think you're really onto something there. You can give a command to a computer, you can but it can only go so far, it can only follow. And so how do we move into this space of poetry and poetics that still holds the import of Aristotelian ideology about poetics, but also allows us to expand in the human way, not saying that order is not human, because it is. So yeah, so what do you think, how can we counter this?
Just off the top of my head, I would say a good way to do it is to bring to bear our idea of poetics and our idea of humanity to code and to coders. I think a lot about how we have questions of AI and the question of the all of the patriarchal influence on it, the racist influence, et cetera, which are good things to analyze. But I think along with analyzing that and pulling that out, right, a human being who's been affected by our culture has created this code is a good thing to pull out. But I think at the same time we need to pull out what is the beauty of it, what is the goodness in it, right? Truth, beauty, and the good for that Renaissance type of pull. But also I think in using our poetic analysis, like our skills in that, to approach people writing code, we kind of lift code up a little bit more in the sense of our hierarchy of culture in many ways. So I think that's like an approach to use. I don't know how you do that exactly. Like, do you do it on Blue Sky? Do you do it on Instagram? Do you do it in your classroom? I don't know, but
Not on Twitter.
But I think like that's the way to do it. Is we have so many good people who are analyzing all of the really heavy, really strong influences that are these broad cultural ideas that are good to do and good to pull out, that are the negative parts of coding and AI. But I think at the same time we need to focus on some of the more beautiful aspects of it. That doesn't mean to shortfall the bad parts, but it means to create a more nuanced conversation around it.
Thank you. You have a question?
Oh.
Sorry, or whatever you want.
I had a question for Nathan, actually. So I'm really excited to see you talking about polytheistic systems and indigenous worldviews, because I do a lot of work with those in fantasy literature, actually. And I always, I tend to argue that the reasons we need to consider polytheism and indigenous worldviews are because monotheistic religions tend to be so hierarchical and so binary, and so it's sort of like a way out of that. But I noticed that you were also saying, correct me if I've got this wrong, but you seem to be implying that the monotheism is also problematic because there's like one voice, one judge. And I kind of want to hear a little bit about your thinking on the problematics of monotheism in your work. Is it the hierarchy, or is it that there is like one decider at the top, sort of?
Monotheism is a very difficult concept to discuss. and this is kind of what I mean, is that it's not about there being one God. It's about we can't talk to God and get a concrete human voice answer, right? And I'm atheistic. So how I view monotheistic belief is very different from how someone who might be Christian or Muslim would view it. The problem though is that you have someone who's Catholic, for instance, and you have another person who's Catholic, and they're going to have extremely different takes on how they perceive that reality. My point with this is, like in the paper, is not about like there being a sole arbiter, there being a single God. It's about how we perceive that. Because our perceptions of that God are what's going to directly impact how we write. There are some people out there who say, there is nothing in the Bible that says that there's anything about being gay. And there's on the extreme opposite end of the scale, there's people who are saying that gay is a sin, you're going to go to hell. Who's right? All we have are a couple of holy texts, and the Bible, for instance, the Bible is heavily influenced by Milton. So a lot of our religious beliefs, a lot of our actions are not as much impacted by deities, but about our perceptions of those ethics, and that's what's going to translate to artificial intelligence, and then AI would become the sole arbiter. Because once it's implemented at that level, then it becomes something that we can't negotiate with, something that has a right and a wrong, a good and a bad.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yes, hi. I'm very pleasant. As you were saying that just made me start to think, because computational intelligence is our cognitive intelligence put into a machine, wouldn't this AI just give us the answers we're looking for, instead of it being a whole new idea of what this ideology or religion is? Because if we're feeding it information, then it already knows all the answers, and it'll give us just what we're looking for.
I think it'll give us the answers that we give it. I don't think it'll necessarily generate completely new concepts of morality. We can try to manage this as best as we can, right? But a while ago, AI thought that black people were gorillas in automated driving, right? Because of how we programmed it. That wasn't anyone's intention. Nobody meant for that to happen. It happened because they didn't go into the programming using black people as an example. So AI didn't understand the whole concept of skin color. Yeah, it's really interesting. But yeah, I think that it'll have the answers that we want it to have, that we program it to have at subconscious and conscious levels.
So would you say that AI would just be the physical of that, and not just, because a lot of religions and things like dealing with the spiritual are not very visual all the time. They put a statue to it, they put a face to it, they put a vision to it. So are you saying we would just put AI machinery into that place?
I guess a better parallel, and as I was actually writing this paper, I was thinking, the concept through which it is framed in Caprica is very monotheistic, right? He directly criticizes the concept of a single God in an otherwise extremely polytheistic society. But when we implement AI, I don't really think about its implementation as a substitute for God, but more about laws, right? If you go into a courtroom for something you did, there's a judge, there's a jury, and they're going to have a level of nuance, and the laws can be changed, right? And that's not necessarily going to be a reality if it gets to the point where AI becomes more entrenched, because it is going to approach things. It's a physical. I don't know how to phrase this. It's a physical representation of legal systems and structures and social views and such that won't really morph with time unless the people who program it, the people who control it, specifically want it to.
So who's to say who's in control? Because that's where my thought process
Keeps going kind of in a circle,
right?
right?
Because the law, the justice system itself is very corrupt. So
Oh, I
imagine
completely
putting
agree, yes.
machinery into that, then you have evil RoboCops.
Basically.
Which we already have.
Yeah, I was just, I mean, that's, there's just so much to think about that, and I think, I mean, we haven't even figured out how to be ethical just as human beings, arguably, right? And so then we complicate what we're creating and how, so it's just, it's a loop, and it's, I mean, thank you. Thank you.
It's a very complicated question.
But it was interesting because I was thinking about what Vivian said before, and I definitely want to use Franny's writing and I think poetry. And one thing I noticed, and I was thinking about the cyborg is the cybernetic with the organism. That's where the word I think comes from, right? And so I found it really interesting that there were so many physical, maybe what is the human, whatever that means, right? Is sort of the popping up or the emergence of the natural, you have the musk from, yes, it's also a sort of destructive human image of, that perfumes are made from dead animals. You've got the steel musk, the teeth, the mouth, I don't remember all of the other, but I did find that seemed important, that's emerging. There is this very focus on the body, focus on the human body. So maybe, I mean, I don't have an answer to what you were bringing up, but I do think that is, obviously that's coming up in Franny's work somehow, so I wonder, what do you do with that when you talk about Franny's writing?
So that's one of the fun things about Franny's writing is that it's so bodily and so engaging with ideas of science fiction that it pulls out these broad ideas back to our human beings and themselves, right? Because I think in most science fiction, right, when you space opera, it's all about giant battles and big wars, which are really awesome and really cool and really fun. But Franny and going into cognitive estrangement and forming the poet as the cyborg and then engaging in a lot of these different science fictional tropes throughout their work, pulls it back into the self in a lot of ways and pulls it back into their own body. But in doing that, the reader is then pulled back into their body as well, while at the same time joining Franny's body. And so there's this interesting like interconnected aspect in and across like poetry that Franny writes. And it's interesting as well because they deal a lot with language and playing with language. So in that algorithmic poem, you can go to the front of the book and Franny created a glossary where all these words mean different things, and if you track that throughout the book, it changes the poems in different ways, where it's like blood actually means this, or this means that, and there are different ways to read it and all those aspects, which just shows the complicated different connections of it. It's one of the fun parts of the poetry that allows you to pull a lot out of it, is that Franny always wants you returning back in and kind of doing what you would do with a fantasy book or a science fiction book, where it's like, oh, in the first book they said this and they had this prophecy, and now is that going to be true? Not really, yes, and you have to return to that. And it's this almost discursive, recursive thing within the poetry. That again, though, I think always returns us to being human at the end of the day, being an existing being that is different than, say, a table or something like that.
Adam, I'd like to know, if AI can write poetry, does that mean that human poets are obsolete?
I would say no, emphatically. I think like that's one of the things that we have to struggle with AI being as it is right now and being like a language model. And we can push, because to me it brings the question of what is poetry? Is it what the poet creates, or is it what the reader reads? And poetry is always created in that relationship between the poet is writing something, they're creating a poem, and then the reader is reading it and taking it into themselves. So we have poets who will always write poetry as a way of dealing with their individual self and expanding themselves, and then they share it with someone else and they read it, and that forms it more into poetry, which is why I think I was like thinking through that difference of poem and poetry, where an AI can generate a poem, an individual text that you call a poem, but creating poetry itself is something that is a very intimate relationship thing. While at the same time, if you think that and you apply that to reading an AI poem without knowing that's an AI written poem, that could be a creation of poetry in some ways. So I think it's complicated in that sense.
So that's reader responsibility, because you're saying the crux of the worth of the poem is in the reader.
So I'm saying both. It's in the poet who creates it, but also when the reader reads it, it does other things.
A very quick comment to that. I was thinking when you were talking about, sorry. I was thinking when you were talking about poetry. So I'm on a queer Discord for writers, and I was just talking casually, and I wrote a really short message. I forget about what. It was either the economy or heat, and I used like literal plus icons because I was being really, really lazy with what I was writing. And there's this haiku bot on the Discord, and it took what I wrote and it reshaped it to haiku because it matched the perfect number of syllables. And when you read it like that, it was a dramatically different piece of writing from the casual, who cares, literal plus signs instead of like saying and. It dramatically reshaped how I read my own writing. And that was not even an AI, that was just a basic scanning algorithm. I think, there's a lot of commentary to be done there about how we read and perceive poetry as a very vital component of poetry.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you for your lovely presentations. Thank you all. So we are now at lunch, and there is food here. So please help yourselves.
So